major sponsors, and we couldn't do this work without you. I want to acknowledge and thank Maxime, who's here from Contact North. Contact North also sponsors our work, as well as BC Campus, Campus Manitoba, D2L. Those have all been sponsors this year. We also have amazing partners, Bayview Analytics in the US and Academica Group. So I thank those as well. I also want to thank this year and just to acknowledge, because it ties into what we're doing in inclusion. This year we brought on an Indigenous consultant who is also disabled, and to review our work and to give us insights from that perspective. So I want to thank Alison Tedford-Seaweed, who resides back in BC, but has been instrumental in providing feedback to our work and really challenged my way of thinking and looking at these findings. I also want to thank our CDLRA team, in particular our Director of Analytics, Dr. Jeff Seaman. I know he's watching live on the live stream, so shout out to him. But he does a lot of work for us, and this data processing, all the stuff that goes on behind the scenes wouldn't be possible without him. So very grateful for him. Grateful for our board of directors, and also for students from the Master of Educational Technology program at UBC this year, who have been coming along and looking at our data in new and fresh ways, giving me fantastic insights and coming in just really with new ways in thinking about what we're seeing in the findings. All right, so these are sort of an overview of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to go through the slides pretty quickly. There's a lot of data. The slides are mostly charts, and I'll be talking about what they mean. But at the end of this all, I'm also want to talk about the implications for the future. And that's where I'm going to talk about some of those paradoxes and where more work is needed as we go forward. We're at a really interesting time where, you know, the pandemic, I'm not comfortable saying the pandemic is over. I think we're still really struggling. There's a lot going on, but I would also say that in a sense, the dust is settling, which makes it a really interesting time to be looking at these findings and results. Okay, so a bit of background to our research here. Our surveys were conducted in spring and fall of 2022. So for some of you who are familiar with our work in the past, this might be a bit different. We previously did one annual survey that went out once a year. It was a heavy lifting survey passed to multiple people per institution. This year we took a different approach. We actually surveyed multiple people at each institution in different roles, because going forward, we want to start breaking down by perspectives by roles. And are we seeing some differences between what administrators are thinking of these issues, what teaching and learning leaders are thinking of these issues, also our deans, directors, and I think that leads to important insights. It's also important from an inclusivity standpoint. We are going to get more diverse voices if we open up to more people in more roles, which particularly allows us to get insights into accessibility, insights into how to better decolonize our work, and a lot of the important things that I know we all agree that we want to see going forward. As you can see, the findings here from spring and fall, Ontario, we had 80 respondents representing 33 institutions. Fall, we had 67 respondents from Ontario representing 36 institutions, and combined, we had 147 individuals from Ontario, which represented 45 institutions. Most institutions were public post-secondary institutions throughout Canada. However, we did get a handful of responses as well from private institutions and Indigenous institutes. So that's included in there as well this year. So as we're talking about participants, just a quick breakdown by role, you can see that, considerable amount of teaching and learning leaders for the fall surveys, but for the most part, we've got, a fairly standard breakdown by role. So there isn't one role that's more heavily influencing the results than the other. I also want to get going, before we get going, categorizing key terms. And this has been a really important piece of our work. I could do, and I have done full sessions on this. I am just going to give the really quick top level Findings on this, we've got a report out. It has US findings. We did a research study posted in the Online Learning Journal. We also did a parallel study in Canada. As you can see, really consistent findings between Canada and the US. The key thing with these definitions is this is the language that is being used on the ground. So previous work on definitions has focused sort of more theoretically and philosophically on what we should be terming things or how we should be defining things. And I think that work has been very important as a starting point. But as online learning and hybrid learning has become so much more prevalent during the pandemic and more people are using these terms, we need to use the terms that are being used daily on the ground. And these words capture where we actually have a lot of consensus. There's a lot of work that went on to develop these terms. I'm happy to discuss that with anyone individually. It's beyond the scope of this presentation. But like I said, I can absolutely dig deeper into this with anyone who would like to. But when I speak and use these terms during this presentation, this is what I mean. So when I say online learning, I'm meaning learning that is fully online, no in-person option. When I say hybrid learning, there is some requirement for being in person, some requirement for being online. When I say hybrid could also be instructor prescribed, such as flipped learning, or where there's, you have to attend mostly online, but in an in-person intensive, or it could be student-led in the case of HyFlex or multi-access learning, where students can flip between modalities as they choose on a day-to-day basis. So again, that's just the terms that I'll be using during the presentation. We also created, and again, I can go into this in depth in more conversations, but our modes of learning spectrum. And this is described in great detail in the journal article that we published this fall, and why we came up with what we came up. But the key point of this is these are big buckets in which we have variations of the different terms. And again, this is based on our research on how these terms are being used on the ground. So with that said, and again, inviting more conversation at a different time, I'm going to move into the Ontario specific findings on other topics from the survey. So what we have here is that one of the things we asked is what teaching and learning challenges are most pressing. And in Ontario, we can see that one of the top challenges is faculty fatigue and burnout across the board. That was a national thing as well, but it's really important. And I'm going to come back to that when I go into the implications, because in all we do, we have to ground it in the fact that our faculty are burned out. So any decisions we make, anything we do going forward has to take into consideration where our faculty are at right now. One of the wonderful things we see too is there's an interest in that effective instructional practices for teaching online. So it's sort of two sides of a coin. While it's a challenge, it also shows us that the opportunity and desire is there, that we want our courses that are being delivered online to be taught in an effective way. And also, and not surprisingly, we see effective assessment practices up there. That's been a huge challenge, and with proctoring and how do we assess. And again, I'm going to talk to that a bit more in terms of the implications. When we get into anticipated trends, so we asked what what they expected to be most likely over the next 24 months. Now, this is really critical. When we asked this question, we actually grounded it in the present. And this was in spring 2022 in our survey. So we said compared to right now. So these answers are not people thinking compared to pre-pandemic. These are compared to right now, where we're at, what do we see the trends being for the next 24 months? We see a huge trend towards alternative credential offerings, that there's going to be that likelihood. That's also not surprising when, like Robert mentioned, a lot of our learners coming in aren't necessarily traditional learners. And as we're opening up new pathways, that flexibility that we're seeing a desire for extends beyond just the learning experiences themselves in a traditional higher ed program, but also that flexibility in terms of pathways towards credentials. We see an interest There's lots of evidence. I've seen this in my research, not just in the Canadian context, but across the board in the work I've done in US, other studies that I've done that have been more qualitative. A strong interest in hybrid learning. We see that that is going to be increasing. We see even more so than the online, which is really interesting. So that, you know, to hear the talk throughout this conference about hybrid learning, inclusivity, flexibility, that all supports this trend that we're going to likely see this increase in hybrid learning, or at least that's what our respondents expect to see. We also see that there's that increase, you know, resources in instructional design, upgrades to infrastructure. And again, this is compared to the present. So this isn't upgrades compared to pre-pandemic. We're still seeing over half of our respondents predicting that there's going to be upgrades to their institution's infrastructure compared to the right now. So that's a really important to ground that in that. This is interesting, and I want to give a caveat to this. When we talk about student preferences, we did not survey students themselves, so that's important. But a lot of the people who respond to our survey have access to the institutional student surveys. And as we've done this research, as we've talked, you know, to the people who typically respond to our surveys, they've told us, yeah, I'm basing my response on the student surveys we've done. So we feel confident that this still accurately captures what students are predicting. This isn't just based on someone's opinion, but it really is based on the data they're gathering and the observations that they're seeing at their institution. Not surprisingly, students are wanting more flexibility. They want that choice, and they also want more technology used in their courses, regardless of mode. So that tells us that, you know, this is an opportune time. I think one of the key things that as the dust settles from this, despite the narrative that everyone wants to go back to how it was before, I think those are a minority of very loud voices sometimes that are in the room. We're not seeing that in the data at all across the board. In fact, we're seeing the opposite. We're seeing that because people have experienced flexibility, there's that desire there. The potential has been seen in terms of what this can do. I don't know, I have to press the button with a little bit more emphasis. There we go. That did it. Demand for learning modes. We asked by breakdown of student in our spring survey to see if there was any difference in terms of what types of students might like to learn in different ways. That hybrid, so the mix of online and in person, the fully online, and the in-person options. When we looked at a comparison of, you know, perceptions on what international versus domestic students were interested in, we certainly saw amongst international students that interest in online being the greatest, which makes a lot of sense with travel and with issues with surrounding, you know, all the stuff that's surrounded international students. With domestic students, again, they're really seeing that strong interest towards hybrid, and more so than just fully in person or fully in line. It supports that narrative that flexibility is actually what's wanted going forward. All right, there we go. Again, we broke it down by undergraduate, graduate, and professional students. Professional students, fully online. We're seeing graduate students wanting that hybrid. And again, the undergraduate students wanting that hybrid experience, but also a significant number wanting that in-person experience, which makes sense because that's where we would be most likely seeing, you know, the traditional 18 to 24-year-old student who's wanting that on-campus experience. But we also have a lot of other students there too who are wanting, you know, more flexible options, who don't necessarily fit what we would have traditionally categorized as our undergraduate students. Going into this was an interesting one with teaching with technology. So with all this desire and with all the want of the support, we know that students are interested in this. We also know that faculty are interested in this. We know that they're from an EDI perspective, this is important. But with institutions providing funding and resources for faculty to use innovative technologies in their courses. So we have just under half of respondents agreeing. So when we talk about areas where more work is needed, particularly if we have that desire for EDI and for accessibility and inclusion, we need to look at whether we're supporting faculty to be able to use those technologies that will provide that. So that's just an interesting point. And again, all of these are data, they're points that just give us a bit more clues to what's going on, but they also spark the need for more research. We don't necessarily always know the why behind this data point, being that it's a quantitative data point. But for us at our organization, this always inspires the questions that we'll probably ask in the next year. All right, so we asked about professional development as well. This was in our fall survey, and this was supporting faculty. Now, we had asked a similar question in 2019. This question this year in 2022 focused on prior to the first online teaching experience. Most institutions are offering professional development of some sort. However, it is mostly voluntary. And again, more research is needed to understand why that is and what that means, especially because this is prior to teaching a first online course. Does that have something to do with the fact that a lot of professors and a lot of instructors taught online during the pandemic, so they may not fall into that category? Or is this something that we need to look at in terms of what types of supports are needed? And is there some sort of mandate? I see, yes. Oh, good point. Yeah. So what we do is for online in that big bucket, we have online capturing both. It could be online asynchronous, online synchronous, or a mix of the two. Within the big bucket of definitions, we then put what we call variations. So the variations that we put in there would be online synchronous, online asynchronous. We also acknowledge that some institutions refer to online as being either only synchronous or conversely only asynchronous. Some institutions might call something that's asynchronous remote, or they might call something that is online and synchronous remote. So there's a lot of names under there, which is part of the reason for our work on definitions. But thank you. That's a really important question to clarify. We also asked about the topics related to professional development. And I'm going to come back to this, or I'm going to try to remember to come back to this when I talk about those implications. When we see that most of the professional development is just focused, there's a lot on using the institution's LMS. And I don't want to actually discount the importance of that. It is really, really important for faculty to be familiar and comfortable with using the institution's LMS. That's actually a really, really critical thing. Same thing with online assessment practices. That's been one of the big challenges that we've seen during the pandemic. And it's important for faculty to know new ways. Now, this is one of those caveats we need to dig deeper into that. Does that professional development just look like training faculty on online proctoring systems? Or does that look like actually looking at alternative assessment techniques? That's important. How to teach in multiple modalities. I was really excited to see that the majority of Ontario institutions are providing professional development for that. We know that with that desire for flexible teaching, for hybrid teaching, that's going to be a demand on our faculty going forward, is that they are able to teach and teach well in multiple modalities. Again, all of these things are very top level, and certainly a deeper dive is needed to know, what does that mean? What does that training for teaching in multiple modalities look like? We do want to make sure at a certain point that it's not just showing how to, record videos and post them on the LMS, or, but that we're actually looking at interactive pedagogies. We can't capture that, or didn't capture that in the survey, but that is certainly an area where more research is needed. And as we see too, some of it is just the basic how to use video-based technologies in teaching and learning. I say that again with the same point that I made with the LMS. That's also really critically important. That's one of those basic skills that's going to happen. We need to be able to move faculty beyond just, using video technologies and how to do it in engaging ways, but we also need them to know how to use the video-based technologies as well. There we go. EDI, we went into this year. One of the caveats to that is we need like the work we've done in definitions for online learning terms. Right now, there's a lot of different meanings that are attached to equity, diversity, and inclusion. I found that in my conversations. Different people have different meanings. So this still just kind of captures the individual respondents' definition of what they think EDI is. We need to do some more work and find out what they mean when they say those terms. But for now, that is in general what we're looking at. We asked a few questions about what institutions are doing. We also, as you'll see in one of the upcoming slides, we asked about in-person as well. We didn't want to make the assumption that EDI is being done well in-person contexts and not well in online. We actually wanted to take a look at both, and there's some interesting findings coming up a couple of slides from now on that. But the questions we asked are they providing help to faculty members and, supporting the design of accessible courses, students who face barriers to taking online and hybrid courses, putting a priority on online and hybrid courses, EDI principles and designing that, flexible course options for students. And so we see actually a lot of agreement there, not a lot of disagreement, which is really encouraging that this is a priority for institutions. And while I think we can all collectively agree that there's room for improvement, it's exciting to see that this is up there on the priority list. And I think that's sort of the point that we really want to, hang our hats on, is institutions are wanting this. They know that this is important, and that's a really important first step. There we go. So this is the slide that I thought was really interesting. We had respondents give their institution a letter grade, so to speak, on, and I know that that's very subjective between what's the difference between a B and a C, but we wanted to see if they could give their institution a letter grade on how well they do at incorporating EDI principles into online and hybrid courses, and also in-person courses. What would they give their institution? As you can see, not a whole lot of difference between online and in person. So which tells us, and both, wasn't shocking. Both is sort of like the, okay, B's and C's across the board. So doing some things right. We're not failing miserably at this. We're not getting a gold star for this either, but we're learning. And hopefully this is one question that we want to ask for a number of years. And my hope is that, if I'm presenting 3 years time from now, we can see improvement. We can see maybe a shift to more A's and B's in how this is being done. So implications, paradoxes. Common understanding of key terms is critical. We have to have common language if we're going to discuss these things. Within an institution, we understand that institutions brand their courses in different ways, and there's different things that aren't necessarily easily changeable. Part of our goal with creating our modes of learning spectrum is that we can capture the different definitions, we can capture the different things that institutions are calling themselves without forcing them to change what they're calling their offerings, but still measure it and talk about it collectively when we're bringing people from multiple institutions together at events such as this. We also, the findings are just clear. There, the widespread use of digital technologies in teaching and learning going forward, that's, it's here to stay. I would be very surprised with the data that I'm seeing if there's that shift back. Our students aren't wanting that. Institutions are facing pressure from students who are saying, we want more flexibility. So that in and of itself is telling me that there's going to be that shift going forward, more towards technology use, more towards different modes of learning coming in. And that's a really important thing. And I want to caveat that from an accessibility and an inclusion standpoint, in-person learning will continue to play a critical role. By no means are we eliminating in-person learning. For some learners, it is really important that they are going onto campus and they are learning in an in-person context. And we can't diminish that in our excitement for innovation and technology and change. That door needs to stay open to our learners, but we also need to open more doors to more learners who weren't being served when higher education was mostly in an in-person context. There's that desire for flexibility. Like Robert said, the student demographic is changing. We've got mature students. We've got students, in our day and age with inflation and costs who do have to work and have to hold down a job while going to school and need to be able to have flexibility in when they attend their courses. That facilitates accessibility. And it's really, really important to acknowledge that there is a whole bunch of learners. There's people who really could benefit society from having a post-secondary education or having some sort of micro-credentials to improve where they are, to move them up in their career. And if we're not providing flexible options, we're not opening doors for these people that we really need to be in these roles in our society. This is a fun time. There is an opportunity right now that didn't exist before to experiment with new strategies, to enhance and to provide learning experiences for a hopefully increasingly diverse student body. I think we've got some room to grow with that. I think our student body is not as diverse as it could be at many institutions. And that's something for those in leadership roles to think on and reflect on, and again, prioritizing funding in many ways where it goes, and towards supporting pathways and opening doors for students to increase the diversity of the student body. We also need to develop strategies to support instructors and meeting them where they're at. And again, that's one of the paradoxes. We need all these things. We need instructors to be able to teach in new ways and do new things, and they're really burned out. And that's a challenge. I don't have an easy answer to that one. Listening to faculty is important, not, meeting them where they're at, not overlooking the fact that they're very burnt out, particularly if we're looking at adjunct faculty as well. We know that there's a lot of adjunct faculty who may not even have access to the training they need. They may be hired a couple days before their course even begins, and they're sort of thrown into it. And how do we balance that? How do we balance, budget constraints with a real need for more robust faculty support, not just student support, but faculty support? I think the biggest paradox that I kind of want to wrap things up with, that I've really been thinking on as I've been going through this year, as I've been looking through this data, is this notion that's been long held that in-person instruction should be the gold standard for how we deliver and how we do post-secondary education. I don't think in-person instruction was ever phenomenal. I think it's just what we were all used to. And, I've said to a few people, when you take a course with a poor in-person course, I think we've all done that. We've had an in-person class and it just really wasn't great. And you walk away and you tend to you blame, in many cases, the instructor, be like, man, that just wasn't a great course. The instructor didn't, it just didn't work out. With online learning and hybrid learning, it's different because people walk away from the course and they blame the modality. I can't imagine having a poor in-person course and walking away and going, oh, in-person learning is terrible. I'm not going to do that anymore. But we tend to go that way with online learning, and we need to sort of reframe that and say, okay, that course didn't work out. What was the issue? Was it the modality? Probably not. Actually, there's many instances where online and hybrid learning and multi-access learning have been very successful. Is it a situation? I don't support blaming the instructor. I think, by the way, I think we should then look at it and say, how can we better support our instructors? Do our faculty need some sort of better support going forward? But I think that as we move forward, that's our thing, is not using this traditional in-person learning experience that was arguably very exclusive of a lot of people as the standard to which we measure our online and hybrid learning experiences going forward. I think what we need is to rethink, recalibrate, and look at what we have going on and saying, what are quality learning experiences, regardless of modality? And my hope is to keep doing research like this year after year, where I can hopefully find, provide some anchoring points in how we're doing with that, and how our faculty, how our teaching and learning leaders, how administrators are feeling about this, and whether we're seeing improvements and changes over time. All right. This button's really picky, by the way. Oh, it needs gusto. I mean, this is my last slide. There we go. My contact information. That's the most important thing. If you have any questions, I hope to speak with many of you throughout the day today. Happy to, I'll be here all day, happy to answer any questions that you have and hear your thoughts. I'll come to you in just a second. I do want to mention, as we're opening up our survey to people in different roles, if you would like to be added to our survey roster so that you receive a copy of our surveys when they come out, please send me an email and just say, hey, I'm so-and-so, please add me to your roster. If you can add the role, whatever your role is, and that would be great, because that's always helpful for us when we are looking at people by roles. But, email me anytime. Our Ontario report will be likely released. We'll talk to Laura, hopefully, fingers crossed, within the next few weeks. And it goes into this in a lot more detail. I know eCampus Ontario will be sharing with you when that comes out. And at the same time, happy to answer questions about that. With that said, I think I'm gonna open the floor and the Zoom lines. Thank you.
Testing.
Hi, thank you very much for this. This was absolutely fascinating. I may have stepped out when you mentioned this, but what journal was your article published in again?
Oh, yes, online learning. So it's the OLC journal, and it was in the September issue. Yeah.
So we touched briefly on metrics that attempted to reflect the student experience at this moment in time.
Yeah.
Is there any mechanism by which, at a macro level, in this sense, some perceptions are attempted to be authentically collected from students?
Yeah, that's a really good point. One of the things we've done each year, and we're hoping to, I don't know if we'll be able to do it in 2023, but hopefully over the next couple of years, every time we've done a survey, especially when we're asking administrators, we've asked if we can, would we be able to partner, would be able to have access to even the aggregate data from their student surveys. And our hope is over time to be able to do that. When surveying students, there's a lot of ethical constraints on us from a research perspective that don't exist when we're surveying people at, faculty and staff positions. That's been our biggest barrier. And with the projects I've worked on in the US, I have worked on projects that have collected the authentic student voice. They are consistent to what we're seeing. The US is different with their privacy laws versus Canada in terms of being able to access students. In the US, you can just get access to an email list. So it's a lot of it is just logistical challenges, but we really hope to be able to do that.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I was very interested, especially in the one sentence you mentioned about contingent contract faculty. Keeping that in mind, and what you also shared about professional development being optional at many institutions, and in the college sector in Ontario, the majority of teaching is being done by contract faculty. Do you perceive that there'll be any research being done on how institutions can support and support with money as well, the learning that contract faculty need in order to deliver post-secondary education?
Yeah, it's a really important comment. It's a challenge. I don't have an easy answer to that. I think it comes into, the agentification of post-secondary education and sort of the challenges that it brings with it. I think we'll probably, we always have to look at, there's so many questions we would love to ask in our surveys and so many levels of depth, and yet we also have to keep it at 10 minutes or less for the respondent. Otherwise, we're not going to get the responses we need. I think breaking that down by adjunct and asking if respondents are in an adjunct position, we might, be able to put in a question in there in the future. And I think that would be important to see what sort of support. Anecdotally, and from the different studies I've done and qualitative work I've done, I would certainly say that, I don't know if I can have enough that I can speak specifically to Ontario, but Canada-wide, I would say there definitely is more need for support for adjunct faculty. I think many times they are just kind of put in there, expected to teach, and that training isn't necessarily there for them. It might be only there for full-time faculty. So I think I don't have an answer to your question per se, but it's a point that I've considered myself, and I think we need to further research that, especially if our goal is improving the quality of learning experiences for students and we're relying on an adjunct model of learning. Then there has to be that training that comes in there.
Yeah, I guess my question is kind of along those same lines about support, but in terms of support for students, because I'm thinking about offering all these modalities, talking about flexibility, and then I, along with being someone who works with faculty and instructors, I also teach first-year students, and the amount of time management issues or trying to manage all these options and flexibility and how to choose what works for you. Is there any interest in looking into what supports are needed for students to be able to navigate this in terms of the way you research it in the future?
Yeah, and I think so. Again, that comes into sort of the same answer to, how many questions we can ask on a, on a survey. That need for wraparound supports for students, it's critical. I think one of the things we've seen in our comments, so we, along with this is just the quantitative findings, but we have asked open-ended questions in our surveys, and a lot of the responses do talk about that. It talks about the student needs. We certainly see that there's concern that students, particularly in remote communities, might not have access to reliable internet per se. So there's challenges for that. I know Maxime's probably the person to talk to about supporting students who live in remote areas. It's a tough one because when we look at all the student needs, there's so many diverse needs, from learning disability needs to looking at our structures. And again, that decolonization, what structures are in there that actually need to be removed because they are not serving students who are Indigenous or who are racialized. There's just so much there. I think it's really great that this is coming to mind. Again, we don't have easy or simple answers, but I think the fact that we're even having these conversations, I do think there's not many great things about the pandemic, but the fact that it forced this shift to online learning where so many people had to experience it, it just really shone the spotlight on these inequities, and it sparked these important conversations that we really need to be having when we talk about post-secondary education.
Doing a quick scan, I don't see anything. In the meantime, I'll ask a question that came in from Zoom.
Sure.
Adrian Galway, very interesting presentation. What is the definition of alternative credential offerings used on slide 8?
Yes, good question. Yes, that's one of those areas like EDI where we need some work on that. When we did work in 2019, and we asked institutions about their, alternative credential offerings, it was sort of this, big jumble of terms that were coming in and not a lot of clarity. I think that like EDI, this is one of the areas as we go forward. I think some institutions have very clear understandings. They may use micro credentials, they may use badges. We use the term alternative credentials as sort of right now a loose bucket to put all those things into, but it certainly is an area where more definition work is certainly needed, and I'm excited to pursue it.
We're just going to go over here. Quick time check. We have about 5 more minutes or so.
Okay,
just over
perfect.
5 minutes.
I'm just wondering whether you see any institutional differences and the discipline-based differences in your findings.
Yeah, not like in this, we're not able to go to that level of granularity. But with that said, if I look collectively at all the research that I've done, on this topic, especially from the pandemic, absolutely. Yeah, there's subject differences. Some subjects can be taught much more easily online than other subjects. We saw in the pandemic too, when particularly the trades, there's many trades that it was really challenging to teach, and it sparked sort of different ways of how do we teach these things. So it would, well, it's not captured in this data. I have enough sort of collective data from the work I've done to say that, yeah, it certainly varies by institution, by subject, by and when I say institution, even by the student demographic that is served by a certain institution. Different institutions can have vastly different demographics, and that would impact the extent to which they can, teach and stuff online. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. I was really excited to hear you talk about the differences in terms of what's domestic versus international students want and need, at least in terms of the perspective of those that work with them. Because I feel like international students are often kind of forgotten. I know IRCC has temporarily disabled, regulations around how much hybrid instruction can take place. I was wondering if you have a sense of how many people that you talk to work directly with international students, and if that's something that you're hoping to pursue in the future.
Yeah, I think that falls into, as we go forward, one of the reasons why we're actually asking for by role, because we want to be able to capture those differences and see who's in what role. We don't have that data at this point and that breakdown at this point, but my hope is, the more people that respond to our surveys, the more we are, the bigger our number is, the more that we're able to break down things by role, because our challenge is keeping confidentiality, and our response is anonymous. And we have to make sure that if we break it down a certain way, that we don't get these points where all of a sudden people can go, aha, I know what institution that is, or I know who might have answered that. So that really is what impacts our ability to break things down. So again, it's just the more people that are on our survey roster and respond, the better findings we can give.
Okay, we'll do a quick jump to Zoom again. Do we have any data to reflect what kind of professional development is required or provided for individuals in leadership roles?
Oh, good point. Yeah, not yet, but I think it's needed. And I should say that too, with our, we talk about student fatigue, we talk about faculty burnout, but just anecdotally with what I've done, our administrators are really burnt out too. They sometimes get overlooked. It's been a hard couple of years for our administrators as well, in navigating this. There's been no blueprint to follow. There was no one who went before this and said, oh yes, this is what you do in a global pandemic where everything has to go online. This is how you manage that. So I think it brings an important point that we do need supports for our leaders, the people in leadership roles, and that training and how to do this, because we are venturing into new territory. I say that with a caveat. There's a lot of great online learning resources and distance ed resources that have been around for decades, but you know, people may not yet be familiar with those. And the more that those of us who are here and who are more familiar with educational technology can be, you know, offering those resources and supports to those who are even in leadership roles, that's really helpful as well. Because we can't assume that everyone has had access to this knowledge and this long-term, you know, and the work that's been done over the decades in the field of distance and online education.
We have time for maybe one more question, if there's anyone else. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Thanks so much. I just wanted to mention that eCampus Ontario is currently undertaking efforts to build academic programming for academic leaders with support from the virtual learning strategy, the second round of funding. And so that'll be available early next spring. We'll roll that out in the learning management system for access across the province for academic leaders.
That is fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. That is amazing.
Maybe we'll just wrap there.
Yeah, I think this is a good place to wrap. Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate the questions and your time.